Guys, Mark Lamont Hill recently went on the Piers Morgan show to discuss O.J. Simpson. As we all know, O.J. Simpson, recently passed away from a long battle with cancer and things like that. And there's a lot of mixed feelings about, the case that he was involved in. Did he do it? Do you think he's innocent? Right. I'm not too familiar with that case, but let's hear what they have to say.
Simpson's murder trial divided America. His death from cancer at the age of 76 last week has had much the same effect. The former NFL star was notoriously acquitted of murdering his ex-wife, Nicole Brown Simpson, and her friend Ron Goldman. A civil jury later found him liable. Many believe he was acquitted by a jury who were angry about racial disparities in the justice system and wider society, a point controversially explained by this CNN contributor.
It was so racially charged because of what had happened just before with Rodney King, but also just how Black Americans feel about policing. It's not like O.J. Simpson was the leader of the civil rights movement of his era. You know, he wasn't a social justice leader, but he represented something for the Black community in that moment, in that trial, particularly because there were two white people who had been killed, and the history around how Black people have been persecuted during slavery. There were just so many layers.
So what should O.J. Simpson's legacy be, and how much of his trial paved the way for the debate still simmering today? Well, joining me to discuss all this is academic and author Mark Lamont Hill, lawyer Alan Dershowitz, who was part of O.J.'s Dream Team defense, lawyer Gloria Allred, who represented the family of Nicole Brown Simpson, and Jeffrey Toobin, author of Run of His Life, on which the seminal real crime series American Nightmare, The People vs. O.J. Simpson, was based. Well, welcome to all of you, a stellar panel. Let me start, first of all, if I may, with you, Alan Dershowitz, because you were part of O.J.'s team. Do you think he did it? I mean, he's dead now. You can be honest.
No, I can't. I'm a lawyer, and I go to my grave with any information he provided me. He asserted his innocence from the very beginning. Remember, the jury didn't find him innocent. The jury found that the evidence did not prove his guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. And jurors afterward were interviewed, and they said they believed that blood was planted on socks found in O.J.'s room, and that the planting of the socks, and there was proof of that, there was EDTA, a chemical, on the blood in the socks. EDTA is not found in such quantity in the human body, but it's found in test tubes to preserve the test tube against coagulation. So the jury had a doubt. The prosecution messed the case up in every way. I was a couple of feet away from O.J. Simpson when Chris Darden tried to get him to try the gloves on, and the gloves didn't fit, and that's the famous line, if it doesn't fit, you must acquit. And the prosecution made a dreadful mistake. Under California law, they could have required him to try the gloves on prior to showing it to the jury to make a decision whether to use this evidence. They didn't do this out of their arrogance, and so it backfired. I was there. I saw the jury looking at him. At that point, I was able to tell him during the recess, you don't have to testify because you've already had your say in front of the jury, and you can't be cross-examined about what you just said in front of the jury. So we didn't win the case. The prosecution lost the case. The jury didn't find him innocent. They found him not guilty as a result of police tampering with the evidence. And so people shouldn't come to the wrong conclusions about this case. This was the American justice system working. Remember, a criminal trial is not a search for truth. Science is a search for truth. A criminal trial balances the search for truth with privacy, with admissibility of evidence, with rules against tampering of evidence. So this was the criminal justice system on trial, and the criminal justice system was acquitted and did the right thing, even if the defendant may have actually committed the crime. Better 10 guilty go free than one innocent be wrongly confined, and make sure that if there's going to be a conviction, it's based on properly obtained and properly admitted evidence. That's the way the system works.
Okay, so Jeffrey Toobin, you're not so restricted by client confidentiality. Is there any doubt that O.J. Simpson committed these crimes?
None. Zero. It is a mathematical certainty, as far as I'm concerned, that O.J. Simpson killed Nicole Brown Simpson and Ron Goldman. I mean, as Alan, my professor, said, I mean, the criminal justice system has other values that are at play. I happen to think that even with the flaws in the prosecution's presentation, which were real, the jury had plenty of evidence with which to convict O.J. Simpson. But just as a historical matter, since this is now well into history, this crime is pushing 30 years old, that O.J. Simpson was guilty and he killed these people, and it is tragic that he never faced accountability for that. But that is how the system works. I certainly respect the jury's verdict, but I think it was wrong.
Gloria Royd, you represented the family of Nicole Brown Simpson. It was interesting watching the coverage of O.J. Simpson's death. People trying to sort of equate celebrating his career prior to this murder with then sort of trying to obfuscate around the issue of whether he was guilty or not of the crime, because, of course, he walked free. What was your perspective on this?
Well, I think it's important to remember that there was a civil trial after the criminal case acquittal. And in that civil trial, a different jury found and decided that, in fact, O.J. Simpson was responsible for the wrongful death of Nicole Brown Simpson, may she rest in peace, and also of Ronald Goldman. And so that's, even though less proof is required, a preponderance of the evidence in a civil case versus beyond a reasonable doubt in a criminal case, still, I think that it's very important to remember that a different jury did find that he was responsible for the wrongful death of two innocent human beings. And that seems to get lost in the discussion that we have been having and that many others also have.
I mean, Gloria, do you have any doubt at all that he did it?
I think it's clear that he did it. I stand with the civil verdict and judgment. And I think it's also important to remember that in the criminal case, appears he did invoke his Fifth Amendment privilege against self-incrimination and remained silent, did not take the witness stand to testify. He had that right to remain silent, and he exercised that right. However, in the civil trial, because he had been acquitted in the criminal case, double jeopardy attached, meaning he couldn't be re-prosecuted, and therefore he had to testify. He was subpoenaed, he was required to testify in the civil lawsuit, and that jury, civil jury, listened to his testimony, listened to his cross-examination, and did not believe him. And hence, that was a major reason for a different result in the civil case, because they didn't believe him. He sat there in the civil case, Piers, next to a large photograph of Nicole with a big black eye on her face that he had inflicted on her. He had pled no contest to that some years earlier, meaning he admitted it. He admitted that he did it. He had not been sentenced to even 1 minute, 1 day in jail as a result of his no contest plea to spousal battery, and he denied doing it. So having said that, no, I agree that he is and was a killer, and that should always be part of his obituary.
Mark Lamont Hill, race played a massive part in this case. There's no doubt about that. And it was a predominantly black jury which acquitted O.J. Simpson of these crimes. There was a belief by many black Americans at the time that this was one in the eye back at the justice system, which they believed had been skewed so unfairly against their people for a very long time. What do you feel about that?
Well, I think it's a little more complicated than that. But let me first say, this is a historic occasion. It's the first time on television that I am completely agreeing with Alan Dershowitz while disagreeing at least slightly with Jeffrey Tubin and Gloria Allred. I think first, this was not just a black jury or majority black jury saying, hey, the criminal legal system is racist and therefore we're going to acquit. This wasn't like a nullification moment. Rather, they genuinely believed that the prosecution didn't make its case. They genuinely believed that there was a good chance that evidence was planted. Mark Furman is the reason why O.J. Simpson is not in prison, as far as I'm concerned. I mean, once that man is caught sort of lying and also is effectively invokes the Fifth Amendment at a moment where the jury is now saying, did you manufacture or plant evidence? I think any reasonable person of any race would make the determination if they're not being driven by passion and emotion, but rather what the criminal justice system demands. I think they say that the jury, rather that the prosecution didn't make its case. I disagree with, and this goes back to your question, Pierce, I disagree with Jeffrey to the extent that O.J. Simpson was absolutely held accountable. You know, if O.J. Simpson spent a considerable amount of time in prison for a crime of theft and kidnapping that no person would have done that amount of time for. If O.J. Simpson had been caught jaywalking in Los Angeles, they would have given him 20 years if they could. So I think there's a way that O.J. Simpson later in his career honestly got a worse outcome from the criminal legal system than he deserved. But let me be very clear. O.J. Simpson's a killer. O.J. Simpson, long before he killed Nicole Brown Simpson and Ronald Goldman, was an awful person. I have no defense of O.J. Simpson. He absolutely is the killer, but the criminal justice system is not designed, as Alan said, as a fact-finding scientific mission. You're balancing the fact-finding with this other principle. And you can't go around convicting people if it's clear that the prosecution and the police didn't play by the rules. And I think for a long time, black people have seen the criminal justice system not play by the rules, and it results in black people being unlawfully incarcerated or police being exonerated, as the LAPD were all the time for beating black people. So yeah, there was a reaction to the legal system, but it wasn't a jury just saying, you know what, the system's unfair, so let's let OJ off. It was them saying, hey, the system's unfair, and this is an example of the prosecution making some bad moves that they probably didn't have to make. I think if they don't plant a glove, I think if Mark Furman never steps into this, he'll still be found guilty. The evidence, as Jeffrey said, was voluminous, but they overplayed their hand and they put too much dip on their chip, and now O.J. Simpson is guilty, or found not guilty, excuse me.
Well, that's a really interesting point. I saw Alan Dershowitz agreeing with that. I mean, it's interesting. Furman, who was one of the lead detectives in this case, obviously was corrupt, and he obviously did try to fit up O.J. Simpson with false evidence. But notwithstanding that, had he not done that at all, do you think... Jeffrey?
But anyway, I didn't interrupt.
So look, I
wasn't proven, but
well, hang on. Let me get my ducks in a row. Jeffrey, am I wrong on facts there?
Well, the issue of whether Mark Furman lied about whether he had used the N-word, and I was the reporter who uncovered the fact that he applied for a pension from the Los Angeles Police Department on the grounds that he hated black people so much that he couldn't function as a police officer, and the LAPD rejected that request and sent him back out on the street. He was certainly a racist, but the issue of whether he planted evidence at in the Simpson case is highly disputed. I don't think he planted evidence, but the LAPD,
yes, you do, Jeffrey. Yes, you do.
Paid the prosecution.
Yes, you do, Jeffrey.
Paid the price for years of terrible conduct. The Rodney King case was only the most famous example of the LAPD's terrible treatment of black people. That was something that the defense, quite correctly, quite understandably, played on with the jury. But whether Mark Furman planted evidence is, I think,
Jeffrey,
not
let me ask you a question.
Yeah, Pierce,
let me ask you a question, Jeffrey.
To court right now, but I do want to add one thing.
Okay, Gloria, I know you have to go. So, Gloria, if you have your final say before we let you go, yeah.
Yeah, my final say, because I'm going to another case, the Rust case, where someone is being sentenced, Hannah Gutierrez, and that is that, you know, the system failed women who are victims of violence by their spouses or significant others. The system, in my opinion, is still failing victims of violence. And yes, it's important to consider, you know, the what law enforcement does, what the police do. But let's not forget, there are many men who are killing their wives, their significant others, and there is still not justice for victims of violence. And it is shown in this case in a big way, but still 30 years later, the system has a long way to go. Thank you very much, Piers, for inviting me today.
Gloria, thank you very much. I know you had to go, so thank you very much indeed for taking the time to join us. Alan Dershowitz, let me come to you.
Gloria.
Yeah, I think we can probably all agree about what Gloria just said. But in relation, Alan, to what your former pupil said, Jeffrey, Alan Dershowitz, you wanted to counter what he said.
Yeah, I want to challenge him. I want to ask him how he can explain the fact that there was a chemical, EDTA, a blood thinner, which if it appeared in the human body would be enough to bleed somebody to death, and that the EDTA was found on the glove, on the sock. The blood splatter evidence proved conclusively that the blood had been poured on the sock when flat, and the jurors afterward who were interviewed, some of them by you, were interviewed, said that the reason they acquitted was not necessarily because they found that he didn't do it, but they found that at least one piece of evidence, perhaps two, had been tampered with. And I actually did an experiment with hundreds of people. Every time I spoke about it, I would ask them the following question. What would you vote if you were on a jury and you concluded the person did it, that there was enough evidence to convict that he did it, enough reasonable evidence to convict that he did it, but you also believe that the police deliberately planted evidence against him in order to enhance the possibility of convicting? And white jurors, black jurors, people all over, I asked that question to everybody, to my class, to everybody I could ask it to. And the vast majority of people, white and black, said they would not convict under those circumstances. So, Jeffrey, how do you explain the presence of EDTA, a blood thinner, found in test tubes but not found in the human body, on the sock that was used as evidence against him? How do you explain it? Why do you think that the evidence wasn't tampered with?
That scientific evidence was disputed at the trial and remains disputed to this day. In order to believe,
give us the dispute. Give us the dispute.
You want an answer, Alan?
What the dispute was.
This is like law. This is like law school class again. This is. I'm enjoying this.
In order to plant that evidence at the murder took place at Bundy, and O.J. lived at Rockingham, a few miles away. When Mark Furman went from Bundy to Rockingham for that first time, when he allegedly planted evidence, he didn't know if O.J. Simpson was even in the United States at the time of the murder. So it would have been insane for him to try to plant evidence on someone.
That's not when he planted the evidence. Jeffrey, you're missing my point. It's not when he planted the evidence. It was weeks later. I went to the lab. I got the socks. I saw the socks. It was only weeks later that the blood was poured by Officer Van Adder, who took the blood home with him. You know that. He took the blood home with him. He had it for several hours. Anise Aschenbach, the juror, acquitted because she couldn't understand how a police officer would take the blood home with him. They planted the evidence weeks afterward, after he was indicted. How do you explain that? The blood, you didn't write about it in your book because it wasn't consistent with your narrative. You didn't write about it in your book. That was bad journalism.
Alan, the idea that Van Adder, who was a lummox of a detective, had the energy and intelligence to plant evidence on DNA where he barely even understood the process. It is completely
DNA.
preposterous.
It was pouring blood on a sock. Jeffrey, you're misleading the people.
Genius to pour blood
took
on the sock.
the blood and he poured it on the sock. It had nothing to do with DNA.
There is no direct evidence of that. No one saw him do it.
There is direct evidence of that.
No, there's not direct
read
evidence.
my
There's
book,
evidence
Reasonable Doubts, in which I put this in, and I quote the jurors, and I quote the evidence, and I quote the scientists. You're not giving us the straight poop. Tell us what the contradictory evidence was. How do you dispute the fact that there was EDTA on the sock? It was. They admitted it.
That there were other people in the lab none of whom saw Van Adder do this. Van Adder had no history.
It wasn't in the lab. It was at his home. Jeffrey,
because Jeffrey,
it was at his home.
What I'm hearing from, let me just jump in for 1 second, guys. What I'm hearing from Jeffrey, though, is an interesting point, which is that there's no direct evidence there's no incontrovertible evidence that it was Van Adder who did the tampering. But Alan's point is still a strong one, which is there is considerable evidence, overwhelming evidence, that the evidence was tampered with and that someone poured blood on a sock. Let's say it's not Van Adder. The point still is the sock
was Van Adder.
I'm not saying it wasn't. My point, though, is even if I accepted Jeffrey's point that it wasn't him, the point to me, and as a juror, if I'm watching this, I don't care which person planted it. I don't care who put the chemical on it. I just know that the evidence was planted weeks after the arrest, and that raises more than reasonable doubt. I don't think this is a tough case here.
Well, I think.
Why didn't you write about it in your book, Jeffrey? Why didn't you write about it in your book?
I don't remember why I didn't write about it in my book, Alan.
I do remember. I do remember why you didn't write about it in your book, because you didn't want to present evidence that undercut your own thesis of guilt. You weren't a fair writer when it came to describing
Alan,
the facts. At least write about it. Put the evidence forward. Put the evidence forward that you think is contradictory. You're saying it's contradictory. You haven't given us one bit of evidence. Tell me the name of the person, the expert, who testified that there wasn't EDTA. There were none. They all admitted it.
This is a case of a domestic violence homicide where a man with a cut on his left index, his left middle finger, walked away from the crime scene bleeding and bled at the crime
I'm
scene
disputing
wearing
your conclusion.
size 11 Bruno Magli shoes that he was photographed in.
I'm not disputing any of that. But you're missing the point. I want to know what your evidence is that there wasn't evidence tampering.
With all due respect, Jeffrey, it does seem like you're redirecting us here. You're pointing to all the strong evidence that's compelling, and I think you're right. There is strong and compelling evidence. Remember, I think he did it.
I agree.
But there's also evidence here that there was tampering, and it's likely that the police were involved in this tampering, and so both things can be true. It seems to me that, and I haven't heard you respond to the EDTA point here. On what basis would we believe that chemical could be there other than through tampering?
All right, guys. Yeah, I'm done. I'm done with this. So obviously, I knew the conversation was gonna go like this, right? It's a divided issue. So, yeah, did he do it? Was he innocent? Don't know.